Good morning, everyone. This is Stuart Cook from PwC, welcoming you to the EU Referendum What's Next for the Energy Sector webcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you all to this session today. Since the EU referendum result came out, lots of attention has been paid in the press and in commentary to the implications for trade, for immigration and for the financial services industry. We felt it was time to begin a conversation on the implications of Brexit for the energy industry. Energy industry, of course, vital to the success of the UK, underpinned everything that happens productively in this country, and therefore it's important that the right attention is paid to the impact of Brexit on that industry. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Gordon Downey, from a partner at Shepherd and Wedderburn, one of the leading UK law firms. Lawyers have a distinct voice to play in this debate. Much of the EU directives have become embedded in UK regulations, and one of the key tasks ahead is to try and navigate through the unravelling of that intertwining of legislation. So I'm absolutely delighted to have Gordon here today. And I'm joined by other colleagues. So Jonathan Gillam, who's a director in our economics and policy practice, specialising in econometrics and economic modelling. He will be speaking to the very latest economic outlook published by PwC post-Brexit on the way in which the referendum result may impact on the macroeconomy. Ronan O'Regan, a colleague in our energy strategy practice, who's worked in all aspects of the energy industry value chain, will be talking in particular about the implications for the energy trilemma. And Lindsay Barras, who's a director in our global immigration practice, will join us for the Q&A at the end of the presentation slides. In previous webcasts that we've delivered, lots of clients have been asking questions around immigration, about the implications for their staff and their recruitment strategies, and I feel certain that there'll be questions which Lindsay is best placed to field. In terms of agenda, what we're planning to do is to spend a few moments talking about the macroeconomic outlook, and I'll ask Jonathan to take the lead on that. We'd then like to talk you through our views about the way in which Brexit might play out in the energy industry, and then allow time for Q&A. And our thinking is sort of 30 minutes on the material that we're prepared in advance, and then 30 minutes for questions from the floor. If you have questions you want to ask, the WebEx facility should provide you with a dialogue box, and I'd encourage you to tap in the questions into that box. We'll pick them up here and we'll sift through those and work out which questions best able to answer in this session. Any questions we can't answer now, we'll endeavour to do so afterwards. And any questions you pose, we will keep your identity anonymous, so don't feel shy about coming forward with questions that you wouldn't want the rest of the audience to hear. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Jonathan to talk about the macroeconomic implications of Brexit.
Thank you very much, Stuart. As Stuart mentioned, we published our UK economic outlook this morning, and in that we have highlighted that we would expect economic growth to slow down over the next 18 months. Our pre-Brexit scenario had economic growth at around 2% for 2017. However, we have revised down our central case from 2% to 0.6% in 2017. We recognise that there is considerable uncertainty around the Brexit scenario, and because of that, we've put two additional scenarios in our analysis, which you can see on our slide. In our more optimistic early recovery scenario, we're assuming that good progress has been made on a deal relating to the UK retaining its access to the EU single market, and also favourable headwinds coming through from the EU and US economies. Our more pessimistic scenario is a recession scenario, where we would expect UK GDP to fall quite significantly, by at least to -1% in 2017, and that would also reflect slow progress and considerable uncertainty being still prevalent in the economy through to 2017 relating to the Brexit negotiations. Generally speaking, we feel that the risk around our forecast is on the downside. Perhaps the pessimistic scenarios or our base case are more realistic than our optimistic scenario. The driver of the downturn relates to a slowdown in business investment, particularly international investment, as investors slow down on purchases on large illiquid assets, particularly commercial property, and we see that already in a slowdown in foreign investment coming into the UK. Coupled with that, though, we would expect consumer spending to slow, particularly on big-ticket consumer durable items. Energy demand could be affected by the slowdown in the wider economy. However, energy demand has proved relatively resilient in the past to slowdown in economic activity. It tends to be a more inelastically purchased item, but goods and services relating to energy-saving equipment might actually feel the pinch on that side, particularly when there's an upfront cost. The UK economy is currently experiencing also considerably weaker exchange rates, particularly against the dollar. Now, that could be a good thing temporarily for UK exporters, but we must also remember that it drives up the cost of imports. People have spoken also about the depreciation against the euro, and what I would urge people to look at is the fact that the sterling-euro exchange rate is currently sort of not far off its 5-year average. So there has been a depreciation, but it's not as dramatic as what we have seen against the dollar. The Bank of England, so far, has been quite reactive in terms of the Brexit decision. There's been announcements around additional liquidity, although interest rates were put on hold last week. We would expect there to be further activity in this area, but we must also remember that the Bank of England's ammunition to use in an economic crisis has been depleted following the financial crisis, so its ability to engage in QE or further measures to stimulate the economy have been somewhat hampered. Nonetheless, the banking sector is in a much stronger position this time round, so hopefully there will be less need for measures like that. At the moment, we're still in the early stages of our Brexit process. It's going to go on for a number of years. We would be able to form a much more reliable position over the coming months in terms of our predictions on the macroeconomy as new data emerges.
Jonathan, thank you. And once again, can I remind people who want to ask questions, potentially of Jonathan and other people speaking today, to use the chat box on the WebEx facility. Lots of people have spoken about uncertainty in the context of Brexit, and it is clear that we're going to face a prolonged period within which the ground will be a little bit unclear. But there are some things that we know now. The Prime Minister has argued that we should only trigger Article 50 when we have a UK-wide negotiating strategy. David Davis has indicated that this is likely to be around the end of this year, 2016, potentially early 2017. And we're aware of the tensions that will underpin all of the negotiations that we have with our European counterparts. On the one hand, a desire, most recently reaffirmed by the Foreign Secretary, to remain within Europe and being committed to Europe, and on the other hand, the clear political imperative to address the challenges around immigration that was formed the platform for the recent referendum result. Now, in previous webcast that PwC has hosted, the conversations have therefore focused around the spectrum of options which might prevail at the end of the negotiation period around our access to the single market and the extent to which that access carries with it free movement of labour and people. But for energy, we think we need to look at the issues with a specific lens, and that is the way in which the Brexit debate may impact upon our relationship with the internal energy market. And to carry that debate forward, I'd like to invite Gordon now to talk you through 3 potential scenarios for the way in which our relationship with the internal energy market, or IEM, might unfold. Gordon.
Thanks, Stuart. I think the uncertainty issue, which Jonathan and Stuart have mentioned, arises not least in relation to the nature of our legal relationship with the EU post-Brexit. And as Stuart said, we've indicated 3 broad scenarios to describe that relationship and the relationship with the internal energy market. Bearing in mind, of course, that the ultimate outcome is unlikely to match exactly any of these scenarios. What we've described, therefore, firstly is the EEA model, given the initial interest which has been expressed in looking towards that model post-Brexit. Norway, for example, being the prime EEA member that has attracted attention. Then on to the right-hand side of the slide, the FTA, free trade area model, given the much more recent statements that have been made concerning Canada, for example, in light of the recently concluded comprehensive trade agreement between the EU and Canada. And then we've also included in the centre a model that may represent something of a halfway house between those 2, called the ECT, or Energy Community Treaty model, which we see in some accession states. Down the left-hand side of the screen, we've set out 5 features against which we can compare these 3 scenarios. Firstly, the extent to which non-EU market participants operate on a level playing field with EU energy market participants. Second, whether the rules that govern the relevant scenario are specifically designed to cater for the energy sector. Third, the quality of influence which can be exerted from outside the internal energy market on the development of policy within the IEM. Fourth, the extent to which the IEM acquis, in other words, the body of EU law which governs the internal energy market, is transposed or adopted in the non-EU states concerned. And finally, the extent to which the non-EU states in the model concerned have delegated their sovereign powers to make energy policy, to legislate, to resolve legal disputes, to independent supranational organisations that sit above the states. So in terms of the EEA model, this currently brings together the EU member states on the one hand, and 3 of the 4 remaining EFTA states, 4 EFTA states, including Switzerland, but Switzerland doesn't take part in the EEA, so 3 of those EFTA states on the other, in a relationship that, at least as regards the IEM, is designed to closely resemble EU membership, and there's systematic adoption of the IEM rulebook governing the electricity and gas sectors, and that's overseen by an independent bureaucracy and a court. Now, while the EEA model provides a high level of continuity with the status quo as far as the UK is concerned, it might be seen as allowing relatively little policy flexibility for the UK, and of course it brings with it free movement of labour. As regards the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement model, these are bilateral agreements established under the World Trade Organization provisions allowing for the establishment of free trade areas with preferential trading arrangements amongst particular states. And the EU has, as I've said, concluded an FTA with Canada. It's also concluded FTAs with Switzerland and with Singapore. These agreements don't include any obligation to adopt IEM rules, and they don't involve the acceptance of independent oversight. An FTA with the UK would certainly allow much more policy flexibility than the other two scenarios on the slide, although at a potential cost of undermining the level playing field between the UK and EU energy market participants. And then the centre of the slide is a description of the features of the Energy Community Treaty, and that brings together the EU member states with a group of states which are candidates for EU accession, generally speaking on the southeastern flank of the EU, in a way which allows them to gradually put in place all of the IEM rulebook as they prepare for accession. And there's more selective adoption of the IEM rulebook with an attenuated degree of independent oversight, which is exercised at the ministerial level. That model doesn't appear to be immediately applicable to the UK, of course, given that this is a state which is looking to loosen its ties to the EU as opposed to tightening them, but it may offer a useful basis for reaching a pragmatic compromise between the EEA model on the one hand and the FTA on the other. And then moving to the next slide, I thought it would be useful, Stuart, just to indicate some features, more detailed features of the EEA model, given that it's one that's generated quite a bit of interest, and how it would apply, or the challenges that it would bring for the UK. The EEA is based on two distinct pillars: the EU pillar, shown on the right-hand side of the slide, and the EFTA pillar, each with its own set of political and legal governance arrangements. However, the EU pillar is undoubtedly the dominant partner in the relationship, and it acts very much as the legislative engine for the EEA. So the risk for the UK going down the EEA route is that controversial EU legislation has to be accepted. It can't be challenged by countries such as the UK if we were in the EFTA pillar. EU legislation is effectively copied and pasted via decisions of a joint committee which brings together representatives of both of the pillars, and that's supplemented by national measures which transpose EU legislation into domestic law within the EFTA pillar. So if the UK were to go down this route, there would be clearly a high degree of continuity, a level playing field for business as regards the regulatory fundamentals, although it's interesting to note that political deadlock has occurred at the Joint Committee level, notably in relation to energy, and so, for instance, the third energy package is not yet transposed into the EFTA pillar, and nor, for that matter, is REMIT, the provision on energy market abuse. The risk, I think, if the UK adopts the EEA model, certainly is that the UK businesses would be forced to comply with EU legislation that potentially does not properly take into account UK needs, unless the UK can somehow ensure that the Joint Committee structure becomes more muscular, you might say, in its attitude to negotiating derogations or exceptions from EU law. The slide also shows the Joint Committee decisions can't actually create domestic law relationships at what you might describe as horizontal level between firms, and that's a departure from the status quo under EU law. The issue for the UK, therefore, in going down the EEA route, is that the government will then have to make a decision, a qualitative decision, as to the extent to which businesses ought to have access to private legal enforcement tools, for example, damages claims, in relation to EEA adopted legislation in the UK. Oversight, as I mentioned earlier, is delegated to an independent international authority called the Surveillance Authority, the ESA, with a fraction of the resource available to the EU Commission, and that's required to exercise a remit as broad as all of the Commission's services and all of the EU agencies. So there is a challenge there in terms of resourcing. There's also a challenge in that the EEA states lack voting rights in the key EU agencies, for example, ACER, and that's led up to growing reluctance in recent years on the part of the Joint Committee to bring in measures such as the third package, which confers a great deal of authority to ACER. The apparent compromise that is being reached in EEA circles at the moment is that the ESA will be required simply to adopt corresponding decisions to reflect what ACER or other agencies decide. Now, that may ensure progress, but it creates a significant risk that firms who are on the receiving end of those corresponding decisions will be significantly worse off as regards their ability to challenge the underlying decision that's been taken at EU level, and that reduces accountability. So in going into an EEA model, there would certainly be a need to look at enhancing the level of accountability available to ESA decisions. Stuart.
Gordon, thank you very much. And again, remind people, I can see some questions already being posed to Gordon, but if people have any other questions that they would like Gordon or others to answer, please use the chat box. What I and my colleague Ronan would now like to do is to take some of the high-level observations that Jonathan and Gordon have provided, and then to drill down and talk about the implications for the energy industry and the energy trilemma. And I'd like to start that conversation by highlighting a few things which are happening at the economy level, which have clearly got a direct bearing on the way companies will do their business. So trade agreements will change, that much is clear, and the exchange rate has changed from where it was before, and both of those things suggest to me that companies will now need to think carefully about where they're purchasing goods and how they configure their supply chain. We've talked about policy dimensions in a number of aspects of this conversation already. I mean, the good news is that UK and European policy have never really been at great tension over the recent years, and so we don't expect there to be a radical change in the way in which the UK government approaches energy policy brought about by Brexit alone. And indeed, there is probably an opportunity under all of the models that Gordon has described to look for opportunities to streamline and harmonise regulations to make it easier for energy companies to do business. But I think it's fair to say that the government's going to have a lot of business work to do, and one of the questions has to be about the priority that some of the important legislation around energy policy will have within the overall legislative agenda in the next couple of years. And we're happy to answer questions on that in the Q&A if people want to ask them. On investment, Rona's going to speak a lot more about investment and the willingness of overseas investors to invest in the UK. But I think it's fair to say that UK infrastructure projects in general and utilities in particular have been seen as a safe haven in the recent weeks, and we've seen their share prices hold firm in the FTSE 100. So I think there is still an appetite for investing in infrastructure. Constitutional issues loom large for energy. Across the Irish Sea in Ireland, there's a question mark now over how the Irish energy market will move forward, given it's a market which spans an EU country and a country which is leaving the EU. And of course, there's always the question about the potential Scottish independence referendum, which would have much more profound implications for the way in which energy policy is taken forward across the UK. Immigration issues I will leave for Lindsay to talk to in question and answers, but lots of companies are already asking us questions about what does this imply about their staff and their recruitment strategies. And Jonathan talked about growth and the way that GDP growth and growth in demand might impact the energy sector. But let me hand over now to Ronan, who will talk through the issues which are seen through the lens of the energy trilemma.
Thanks, Stuart. So, yes, just spend a few minutes going over some high-level observations on current UK energy policy and the potential impacts of Brexit. As Stuart said, it's quite interesting and worth restating that if you look at both EU and UK energy policy, they're pretty much broadly aligned in many areas, specifically around a focus on reliable, clean and affordable energy. although from a policy tools perspective, the UK clearly has tools that they've deployed around CFDs and our own version of a capacity market that varies from EU member countries. So looking across the areas of policy in turn, maybe starting with security of supply. It's the position of the UK, the starting point, it's not great in terms of our dependence on the EU. So if you look at both imports of gas and electricity, we're increasingly reliant on the EU for energy dependence. And the expectation is that, all other things equal, that's a trend that would have increased over time. We've also been benefiting from the fact that continental prices have been significantly lower than UK prices at a wholesale level. So prices in France and Netherlands are 2/3 the level of prices in the UK, and much of that is from investment that European countries have made in renewable energy programs that have helped put downward pressure on prices there. But we've taken some benefit from that through flows through the interconnector. And if you look at how both the DEC and National Grid have quantified the benefits associated with staying within Brexit, most of that was related to the benefits of trade through increasing penetration of interconnectors. And I think DEC had put the value at up to 12 billion over the next 20 years. So I think from a Brexit perspective, we can expect, I think, a number of things. One, it's likely that the whole issue of gas storage may well come back onto the policy agenda. This was looked at a few years ago by government who decided that it wasn't necessary to pursue specific gas storage infrastructure, but I suspect that will now come back on the table for discussion. We're not anticipating any short-term impact in terms of the utilisation of interconnectors, but clearly there is some uncertainty that we think the Brexit decision creates for longer-term investments in interconnectors and the associated benefits. In terms of electricity security of supply, I think that is something that's broadly within the control of UK policy. We have a functioning capacity market, and the success of deployment of further generation in the UK will more than anything be a function of how the capacity market works going forward. In terms of broader investment in energy infrastructure, I think it's clear that we have still significant requirements in terms of investment levels over the next 10 years in terms of some very significant energy projects. And increasingly, the capital required to build those projects is international capital, which, as we all know, is mobile. Let's say that the biggest driver for investments and the impact of investments, I think, from a UK perspective, are not really Brexit per se, but it's more related to the perceptions and commitments to our own energy policy. And if you look back to what happened last year around the announcements in relation to renewable energy subsidies and the impact that had on renewable energy investment, I think that just highlights the importance of clear UK energy policy. I would add to that the risk profile of investment funded under a capacity market or a CFD, we think broadly is unchanged post-Brexit. We haven't seen any evidence yet that the cost of capital has changed. There's been some increase in equity risk premiums, but broadly that's been offset by declining gilt yields. Banks still look well capitalised, and we've seen no impact on corporate debt costs. There is a question clearly around the future role of EIB in terms of funding UK energy infrastructure, and I think that is something that will clearly need to be understood. Previous speakers have touched on the potential impact of a decline in sterling on potential investments. Just moving on to a couple of points on the climate change agenda. I mean, I think broadly this feels neutral. So yes, you can say that the UK would lose a voice at the table in terms of influencing others, but worth highlighting that the UK is not going to hit their 2020 renewable energy target targets, and in terms of performance relative to others, we have underperformed. And the UK also, we're one of the countries that were pushing for no country-specific 2030 renewable targets. And actually, in reality, on some measures, we are well ahead of the EU in terms of climate-related policies. We've ratified the 5th carbon budget, and we have a carbon price support mechanism which has got UK carbon prices well above what we see in the continent. So finally, just moving on to, I guess, affordability. I think it's difficult to construct a scenario where we see prices reducing under a Brexit world, at least in the short term. Key drivers are likely to be mainly the factors we've touched on previously, so impact of exchange rates, impact on cost of capital, although we reiterate what we think is really important for clear statements and continued statements from government around commitments to existing energy policy. And I guess the big area of uncertainty really is probably around what happens to interconnectors, which clearly has the potential to put upward pressure on UK prices to the extent that the future pipeline of interconnectors doesn't all get built out. And as Gordon was saying, ultimately the future role of interconnectors may well be a function of which trade model we end up with. So Stuart, back to you.
Thank you very much. Right, now let's throw open the conversation to questions. We've had quite a few through already. I'd like to start actually with a couple of questions around immigration. Lindsay, I've heard, a number of us have heard the term freedom of movement and freedom of labour. So what's the difference between them?
So, freedom of movement is obviously what we currently have, which basically means that you can come to the UK without a job or frankly anywhere within the European Union to do essentially study, self-sufficient or work. And if you look at the last set of net migration figures, actually about half of the population of EU migrants who came to the UK actually came without a job offer, so they were coming just in a sort of a speculative way to access the UK labour market. Freedom of labour is a more restrictive term, looking at people moving when there is a secured job offer, and it's something that has kind of been looked at as a potential solution to kind of the freedom of movement question. The challenges with that are twofold. Really, actually, interestingly, Britain was the country that called for freedom of movement as opposed to freedom of labour, because we wanted to allow retired British nationals to retire in Spain, and that's essentially why we wanted to expand that right. As in now trying to contract that right is going to be quite hard. And I think secondly, if you look at the way that the UK polices our borders as opposed to the rest of Europe, so essentially in Europe mainly what happens is you will enter the country and then you will be required to register, and it's that registration that they police to check that you are actually complying with your rights under freedom of movement. So often in the European countries, if you haven't registered and the police stop you, for example, they will ask what's happening and you have to provide extra documentation. The UK is very different in how we police our borders, so we police at point of entry. So it would be very hard for us to move to some kind of freedom of labour type approach, because we don't have the capacity or, frankly, at the moment, the money to move to a system which would require checking that people are actually just working in the role that they are in. And the only way to do that under the current system would be at Heathrow or the port of entries that people come in, and that would then cause incredible delays and put quite a lot of pressure on an immigration officer at the port.
That's very interesting, Lindsay, and I hadn't appreciated the subtleties around those. A second question, if you're an employer, where would you be looking to hire now? Given the uncertainty about whether EU nationals will be able to stay within the UK, does it make any sense at all to be hiring from countries outside of the EU?
I think there's two aspects to this. There's kind of a short-term and a slightly longer-term view. I definitely think that companies should be looking at their hiring strategy. So again, if we think about that, that percentage of people who come here without a job, if predominantly your reliance on EU labour is around people who are already in the labour market, that is very unlikely to be a scenario that continues to exist as sort of a pool of available labour physically already in the UK. And so it would make start to think about, well, if that is your business model and how you operate, how could that change? In the short term, you absolutely should continue to look at EU migrants. They have freedom of movement, they have full rights to work here, and in fact actually it's important to note that you can't exclude them from your recruitment process at this point, as that would potentially be a discrimination issue. But I think it is really important for companies to start to think about kind of a wider sort of pool in relation to talent, particularly with the longer term programs such as graduate programs, etc., which will we're looking now at the people you might be recruiting when we've already left.
Thank you, Lindsay. Fascinating. If anybody has any other questions for Lindsay, feel free to use the chat box. Gordon, a question for you. One of the questions from the audience around state aid rules and whether they will still apply if we leave the EU.
Yes, it comes up quite a lot, that question. Certainly in the context of the EEA model, the state aid regime continues to apply. What's different, and I think this may be something that needs more emphasis, is that the administration of the state aid regime moves in the EEA model away from the European Commission and into the ESA, the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which is not bound by any of the policy positions which DG Competition has taken over the years in relation to state aid in the energy sector or in the context of environmental support. So there may be scope actually for policy within the UK state aid space and in the EU to diverge, potentially in a way that's supportive of intervention in the UK. I don't know, Ronan or Zelda, you wanted to chip in on as regards other aspects that you might want to think about in relation to state aid.
Yes, and I guess it does raise the question whether, in some respects, state aid has worked in the favour of the UK government in the past, and rightly or wrongly, when disputes around treatment of the steel industry were played out earlier this year. A lot of the discussion was played back from government to say, actually, our hands are tied because of state aid. And so, there are clearly scenarios whereby it's advantageous for governments to be able to play a state aid card. And I wonder, how much do they feel that they would be giving up as part of a negotiation to offer some form of state aid? Ultimately, if we want to continue to trade energy, it feels difficult to do that if we're not compliant with some form of state aid rules going forward.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you both. So I think what I'm hearing there is the state aid is less binding under the three options you described than now, but even less binding if you go to the Canadian model as opposed to the Norwegian model. Fascinating. Thank you. Jonathan, a question for you. How long do you expect the referendum result to impact on the economy?
I think that will hinge on the length of negotiations and also the style of the negotiations. If it's clear quite early in the process that an agreement can be done and the shape of that agreement will be fairly stable over the negotiation process, then that will reduce a lot of the uncertainty. We would expect the negotiations to last around 2 years. That's consistent with the process outlined in Article 50. It is possible to extend that period, however there are some challenges associated with that. But a shorter, sharper, quicker set of negotiations will help reduce uncertainty and give investors confidence to come to the UK.
Thank you, Jonathan. Gordon, question for you. People have obviously picked up, Gordon, you've got a Scottish accent. So one of the questions around what are the implications if Scotland were to leave the UK for energy markets?
I think, it's a fascinating question. It's also one that's very difficult to predict in that, as we've discussed, there are a number of different permutations here, so it really depends on clearly whether there were ever to be a second referendum. But if Scotland did join the EU, the question is, what would the rest of the UK look like in terms of the models, for example, we've looked at? Would the rest of the UK be in the EEA? Would it be in a free trade agreement context? But clearly there would be implications. Just picking on a couple. At the moment, the transmission grid between Scotland and England is unified in the sense that we have a Great Britain system operator which manages the grid as a single asset in a sense. Question, would that arrangement need to change were there to be an international border or an EU, non-EU border between the two jurisdictions? And also I think there's a question as regards the integration of Scotland and, for that matter, Ireland in relation to the target model, which is intended to apply to couple the markets in the UK and Ireland. Could Scotland continue to be part of the target model if there was another state interposed which is not part of the target model, not coupled with the rest of the wholesale market?
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much. Ronan, question for you. If you had enough money to spend, would you be investing in the UK at the moment?
Well, I think the answer to that is, I mean, just to, I guess, reiterate some of the messages earlier. I think broadly the risk profile around energy investments in the UK hasn't changed post Brexit, and therefore you'd look at each energy investment as you would have done a month ago on its own merits. Broadly, I think there are some very attractive assets out there, both generation assets that are underpinned by either capacity market or contracts for differences, and investment in regulated assets in the UK continue to remain broadly attractive. So I think that the overall investment climate, I think, is still relatively positive from a UK energy infrastructure perspective. That is contingent, I think, on people having confidence that energy policy in the UK is going to remain broadly stable and unchanged. And so, again, just to hammer home the message from what we'd expect from government in this scenario is continued commitment to delivering on existing energy policy.
Thank you very much. Gordon, the question around which of the three options that we've discussed do you think is most likely?
Well, I think that's probably the most difficult question that one could have to face, because as I say, the three models we put up as, if you like, Aunt Sally's for discussion. We know that the Norwegian model, the EEA model, was much discussed at the early stages of discussion around Brexit, but we know that it brings with it a significant political baggage in terms of free movement, which may make it less likely to be adopted. On the other hand, we have the free trade agreement option, which has been much more recently held up as an example of where we ought to head in relation to, for example, the Canadian treaty. It's worth bearing in mind that that treaty took a great deal of time to negotiate, and even now there are questions as to whether the treaty will be ratified. So the free trade agreement negotiations could be protracted, and it's unpredictable what would be in such an agreement. And as regards the ECT model, there's certainly, I think, a degree of attraction to that model in that it allows a substantial continuity of policy, IEM policy. It does involve continued delegation of authority to an independent third party, but it's fundamentally a more political delegation than a bureaucratic one, so perhaps more suitable to a pragmatic exit. the question in relation to that is whether the EU feels comfortable in moving into a model which is, as I said earlier, was specifically designed for countries who want to draw closer to the EU rather than ones who want to step away. I don't really think I've answered your question, but I've perhaps illustrated some of the difficulties in arriving at an answer.
But I think what you're saying is that it's perhaps a little bit too early to say, and that we need to understand the context of the overall negotiating tactics that the government's going to adopt in discussions with the EU and see how those read into the energy market and our relationship with the IEM. Thank you, Gordon. I think another question for you, Lindsay, I think around, as an employer, what action should I be taking in the short term and the long term then?
Sure. So in the short term, I would say there are the two things that I would really recommend that everybody does. The first is communicate with your employees. And this is probably the most important time to have regular and continued dialogue with them to give them some reassurance that they're clearly not getting from the government right now, but to give them that reassurance. And I think to think about that communication as part of your wider kind of diversity agenda, you must be conscious with your communications that if your company is representative of the general population, that you may have at least half of your employees who voted to leave. So it's really, really important to take that into consideration in those communications. The second thing is to understand how you are impacted. A lot of organisations that we're talking to simply don't record individuals who are EA nationals, who have no real sense of who their population are and how they might be impacted. And once you've done that kind of impact analysis, then you can consider whether or not you want to support those individuals in making applications to regarding their EA status. In the longer term, I would say it's really around kind of almost starting to a certain extent with a blank piece of paper regarding looking at where you are going to get talent from, and start to really think again about where that talent might come from, what you might need to change in terms of your recruitment strategy, what you might need to change in terms of your skills that you need and how you might be developing those from the existing UK population. And I would say think about what you want from that and how you can talk to government at this time about what's important in a very realistic way, given that immigration was one of the key issues in the vote leave.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A question around MiFIDs and other regulations. So what's the implications for those?
Stuart, if I chip in.
Yeah. Brenda might have views on this as well, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly that there are huge issues around financial services, but clearly the energy markets and the financial markets are closely connected when it comes to wholesale market activity. I think it's certainly the case in the free trade agreement context that one faces greater challenges in terms of provision of services. So the services that brokers and other intermediaries look to provide across border becomes more challenging if we move further and further away from an EU style model. The expression that's often used there is that of equivalence, and whether the UK regime could meet the equivalence requirements imposed on third countries or on the other party in a free trade agreement, which is, I think, by no means guaranteed. As regards wholesale markets, more specifically around energy and REMIT, as I mentioned, REMIT isn't yet in force in the EEA, and that's because of political disagreement as to the role of ACER. But assuming the EEA model brings with it REMIT compliance and REMIT enforcement, one of the difficulties I think that you encounter if you move away from the EEA model is that you potentially lose access to the market monitoring function performed by ACER and the ability to understand the risk of abuse or the damage that may be being done by abuse, particularly cross-border manipulation. if you're not part of that data gathering market monitoring system.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions which are hunting around the same topic here, around investor sentiment is very important, uncertainty is difficult to handle if you're investing money. We're faced with lots of question marks about continuity of policy going forward, and I think one of the questions from the audience was around shouldn't the Secretary of State be saying something now to try and bolster and reinforce people's confidence at this point? And I guess another way of asking the same question, I might ask you this question, Ronan, is, if you had the ear of government at the moment, what would you be encouraging them to do?
So I think we know from talking to potential investors in UK energy infrastructure that the first thing that they look for from any market is a clear, transparent view on energy policy, both in the short, medium, and longer term. Clearly that's been difficult over the last few years, given we've had some changes to policy because we've tried to deliver affordability, clean energy, and security of supply at the same time, creates some conflicts. But I would say that in terms of what we want from governments, I think probably two things. One is a very stable commitment and clear message around existing energy policy and a commitment to that going forward. And secondly, I think putting the internal energy market fairly high up on the table in terms of their priorities on the grounds that collectively it feels like it's a very good thing for the UK economy to be integrated from an energy perspective with Europe, and we've seen that play out through people's views on the benefits of interconnection. So I think they're the two things that I would highlight as pretty key for government at the moment.
Thank you, Ronan. Gordon, a question for you from the press this morning, actually. There's mention of a legal challenge to invoking Article 50. I wonder if you could just make any observations you choose on that.
Yes, I mean the challenge, or I think there may be more than one challenge, relates to the ability of the UK government exercising prerogative powers to serve the Article 50 notice that would have the effect of ultimately terminating our membership of the EU. Government's position appears to be that there's no barrier to the use of the royal prerogative on the part of ministers in serving that notice. The contrary view is that if you like, the integration of this country with the EU was established by an Act of Parliament, and that, in a sense, what has been done by Parliament can only be undone by Parliament. So those views are on a collision course potentially, which is clearly why the High Court is involved. There appears to be no immediate rush, as I understand it, given the Prime Minister's views on the timetable for Article 50. But I'm sure there's a desire on all sides to see certainty brought to bear, so that ultimately, when the notice does fall to be served, that it's served without doubt as to its validity.
So you're not expecting a decision to happen immediately on that question?
I would be surprised. It doesn't seem to me to be a set of proceedings which will be disposed of urgently. It seems to fall into that category, but I guess we have to wait and see what the High Court says in response to the proceedings.
Fascinating, thank you. I wondered if I could ask each panel member, I might throw my own observations on this. It's always easy in these conversations to focus on the difficulties ahead. I mean, I wonder if each of you could just comment on what you see the opportunities are that the energy industry can capitalise on. And I think if I just kick the ball rolling, it seems to me that successive waves of legislation coming in from Europe have overlaid on each other, and in the fullness of time, it may not be easy to do it immediately, but in the fullness of time, there must be scope to rationalise legislation in a way which makes it work better and easier for companies to comply with. I don't know if Ronan or anybody else would like to comment on that, or other things that they think are opportunities ahead of us.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts just on those positives. Just a couple of examples. If we had a freer hand in relation to designing our energy policy, we take, for example, the distribution networks, principally the power networks. We've got a ruling from the European Court in relation to third-party access to those networks, called the CityWorks ruling, which effectively means any distribution network has to afford third-party access, even though the network may be integrated into a project which is not really suitable for third-party access. That sort of ruling could be delegated from in a UK context. If we were making our own policy on third-party access to distribution networks, how we're formulating our policy as regards energy or electricity distribution. The other example that I guess comes to mind is in relation to the approach taken to the relationship between Ofgem and the Competition and Markets Authority, which was reformed, some might say with undue haste, to replace the arrangement whereby Ofgem would, particularly in the power context, would refer disputed licence modifications, notably on price controls, to the CMA for a second look. That was replaced because of EU law by a regime which now involves Ofgem taking a decision which is then appealed to the CMA, which is a very, very different legal process. And we've seen in the context of recent appeals from Ofgem to the CMA some questions arising as to, for example, in relation to price controls, how an appeal mechanic suits the complex bargain that's struck between industry and the regulator in a price control settlement. That's something which could be redesigned and streamlined, as you say, without the requirement to comply with EU law.
Thank you, Gordon. Ronan?
Well, I guess I think it's just reiterating the importance of having a plan B in the event that we are less dependent on the EU from an energy perspective going forward. We've said that we think the UK is an attractive place to invest from an energy perspective, and therefore I don't think that will change. So I think it's coordinating those things, understanding over the next 5 to 10 years, whether there are new investments in a post-Brexit scenario that would be required, and then facilitating that investment ahead of time.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you have any thoughts on?
I think one of the interesting events to watch will be the autumn statement. So it could well be that the new Chancellor brings in some investment policy measures, so whether that comes through public sector investment in energy infrastructure, or whether it comes through incentives to help the private sector to stimulate energy investment. The autumn statement, I think, is an initial opportunity. There'll be further budgets, etc. But with uncertainty, it often gives government a chance to bring in reform measures. So I would expect some sort of perhaps quite bold moves on the investment side.
Thank you very much. Well, we've reached the end of our allocated hour. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues on the panel for spending time this morning to participate in what I think we'll all agree was a fascinating debate. In terms of our plans for next steps, we're going to continue, like other organisations, I'm sure, to take stock over the summer months, and both PwC and Shepherds will be publishing commentary over the next few weeks and months. We're thinking about providing an update in the autumn as more clarity emerges, and in the meantime I'd encourage anybody who wants to refer to the links on this page to the material which we're publishing periodically. There are a number of questions we didn't have time to cover, so thank you for everybody who sent those questions in. Apologies if we didn't get to yours in the time. We'll do our best to answer them by email or whatever means works best. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to my colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.